Jesus is after our hearts. And so the most important thing we can do when we're starting on this foundation of following after the will of God for our life, the first thing is to make sure that Jesus is the one that has our heart and not anything else.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. For the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about spring cleaning for the soul. And this week, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the will area of our soul.
Yes, knowing whether or not we're following after God's plan for our life, I think is something we can probably all relate to, would be my guess.
Yeah.
But I know this is an area that I have really struggled with at times, and I feel like we all do. It's like, how do I know if I'm following His plan for my life, and how do I check in? And I think it's really important that we do check in, and we kind of check and see, like, okay, am I getting off course? Do I need to pivot? Do I need to go this way? And kind of spring clean some of those things that have to do with the will for our lives.
Yeah, exactly. And I think last week when we were talking about the mind, I compared it to like our closets, and how a lot of times there's clothes that are, dirty or old and we don't need them anymore. Mm-hmm. And so in that area, it's just kind of like, what thoughts do we no longer need, or that are no longer useful to us? And in this area of when we're talking about the will, I was kind of thinking about another reason why we spring clean is to simplify our lives, right? Like there's gotten clutter in our home. And I think a lot of times with us, when we're thinking about our will for our lives, if we're just kind of listening to what we want, it can be very complicated. And I made a list of all the things that I've wanted to do growing up. And here's some examples.
This will be interesting.
Yeah. So since I was a kid, here's a few things that I wanted to do. I wanted to be a ballerina when I was really young.
Of course. Who hasn't?
Who
right?
hasn't?
Yeah.
And then,
I still do.
Yeah, sometimes I still do too. And then I went to SeaWorld one time, and I remember, like, after I saw that SeaWorld, have you seen, like, the thing with the
the girls who dive with the whales?
Yes.
Did you see that one about the girl that died?
Yeah.
That was so sad.
Yeah, I think that took away my desire to want to do that.
That probably ended that desire right there.
But yeah, that made me want to be a marine biologist.
Yes, I wanted to be a marine biologist. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's like every single one. We've had the same thing. And then I wanted to be a therapist. I wanted to be an architect, an interior designer, a writer, a scientific researcher. So the list just goes on. And the reason I made this list is because if I tried to figure out what the will for my life is based off of just the fickle desires that I want from day to day, it would get very cluttered, right? And it would be very complicated. Like every single day, I want, like, my taste buds change. Like, oh, I want Mexican. Now I want Italian food, right?
Happens to me daily.
Exactly. Like hour by hour. And like, even in my job, like, things have shifted in my job to now, like, my job has changed over the last few years so much. And it wasn't even based off of decisions I necessarily made. It was just like these external factors. So my point with this is, like, if we really want to, like, have a will for our life that's clear, we need to make sure that we're, keeping God in that area of our life and making sure we're listening to Him, so that we know, like, so it's not so cluttered, I guess.
That's so good, because I mean, I can completely relate to all of the childhood things that you want to be, right? And then even as an adult, I mean, sometimes I get really excited about something and then give it a couple days, and then I'm like, oh, maybe I shouldn't even try this, right?
Yeah, me too.
How do you know if what you're doing is what you're supposed to be doing? And how do you stay faithful without getting stuck? And how do you progress forward without diving into your own desires and ignoring God? And it's just such a important thing. And so I think it's really good that we're just going to kind of, like you said, simplify this part of our life, because that is probably the biggest thing that needs to happen with this area of our soul, is simplification.
Exactly.
And getting single-minded, right? It says in the word, how to destroy a man's vision, give him two. Or I don't think it says that in the Bible, but it's a saying, right? Yeah. And that's very true. So many of us are walking around with 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 visions for our life. And it doesn't mean you have to have one desire and then never have any other desires, but how do we make sure that in this moment we're following after the right path that's going to take us where we want to go and where God wants to take us? So
Exactly. Yeah.
there's a story in the Bible that I want to share that I think really sets this up really well. And it's the story of the rich man in Luke chapter 18, starting in verse 18. It says, once a religious leader asked Jesus this question, "Good teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" "Why do you call me good?" Jesus asked him. "Only God is truly good. But to answer your question, you know the commandments. You must not commit adultery. You must not murder. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely. Honor your father and mother." The man replied, "I've obeyed all these commandments since I was young." When Jesus heard his answer, he said, "There is still one thing you haven't done. Sell all your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." But when the man heard this, he became very sad, for he was very rich. Evil, right? And I find this story in the Bible interesting because I think a lot of Christians have taken this story out of context and gone, see, in order to really be a Christian and follow Jesus, you have to sell everything. You can't have any worldly goods. You can't have nice things. You have to sell everything, give it to the poor. I don't really feel like that's what's being said. It said when Jesus heard him, he gave this response. Jesus, and you can see this clearly because of what Jesus says. He says, you know the commandments, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that, right? It's like none of those things are actually qualifications, right? He was speaking to people under the law, and he was trying to figure out where are you at, right? And this guy is thinking, well, I've done all that. You know, he basically wanted a pat on the back from Jesus.
Yeah.
But what Jesus could tell that you kind of can see here in the scripture is that something else had the man's heart other than him, his wealth. And having wealth is not bad. It's not a bad thing. In fact, I believe Christians should have wealth so that we can help other people, right?
Yeah.
But Jesus is after our hearts. That's what he wants. And in our quest to find out his will for our lives and what he wants us to do, it's easy to get obsessed with a career or an identity or something that we want to achieve and realize that that has our hearts rather than Jesus. And if that's the case, we will do things, we will compromise, we will go down paths we should not in order to get what we think we want. Jesus is after our hearts. And so the most important thing we can do when we're starting on this foundation of following after the will of God for our life, the first thing is to make sure that Jesus is the one that has our heart and not anything else. And I think just praying and just asking him, God, shine your light in every corner of my heart. If there is something that should not be there, if there is something that has my heart other than you, reveal it to me. And you might be surprised at what comes up. But if Jesus can get your heart, if he can get to that place inside you, then he can get you where he needs to get you, because we're not going to have all the steps starting out, right?
No.
Like you said, you want it to be 10 different things, right?
Yeah.
It's like you just need to know what to do next. And it says his word is a lamp unto our feet, a light unto our path. We have enough light for the next step. Not for the next 10. He's not going to give you that because you need to trust him, because you might try and make it happen on your own. But he gives you enough information to take the next step and the next step and then the next step. And so just kind of realizing that really at the end of the day, it's just about making sure that our heart is his and that's what we truly want. And when that happens, he'll guide us and direct us, and it'll be easy to notice his leading when he's shifting us in different seasons.
Yeah. I'm getting kind of ahead of myself because I was thinking about something else like when you were talking, but it just lines up so much. And I think a lot of people are afraid that if they give their heart to God and they like follow him and his way, they're going to end up doing something they hate. Like,
right.
You know, they're going to end up being, you know, they're not going to have any community. They're going to end up in another country, like
a hut in Africa, or selling all they have and give it to the poor. It's like, who really wants to do that, right?
Exactly.
Like, no one.
Exactly. And so like 3 areas that I was thinking of if you're afraid of this, right? Like it says in the word that God gives us the desires for our heart. He gives us a hope and a future. And he came to give us an abundant life. It says that in John 10:10. So keeping that in back of your mind if you're like afraid or anticipation of well, where's God going to bring me if I give my life to him? It's like, oh, he's there to give you hope, and he's there to give you those desires in your heart. So when we think about this topic, and the will that we have for our life, or the will that God has for our life, there's definitely a couple ways that we can kind of get stuck, and it can keep us from following that. And one of the things that came to mind when I was thinking about this is fear of man. Yeah. And I've been a people pleaser for like probably my whole life. And it says in Proverbs 29:25, fearing people is a dangerous trap, but trusting the Lord means safety. And so when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about like different phases of my life where this has kind of manifested itself, like this fear of man. And I feel like in high school, it can look a lot like peer pressure, right? Like, doing things that aren't God's will for you and like aren't a good idea, but doing them. Because we've all been there, right? Like just doing things that that aren't of God, but you really want people to like you, right? And again, like we've all dealt with this. And I think that, it's hard to think this way when you're young, but when you look back, a lot of the times I think about the people in school that didn't do those things, like weren't so affected by other people. And like, I look at them and I'm like, wow, they were really cool. Like they knew who they were, and like they had a relationship with God that was strong, and it guided them. Like they didn't care so much about how people thought. And I think like when you look back on people like that, it can be an inspiration, and you're not like 30 years old and be like, that kid was so weird. Like you don't really think like that anymore. They were 15 years ago. You don't think like that. So just like keeping that in mind, but another area, when you get a little older, they can become like yes people all the time, right? Like you might have boundaries and you might have limitations that like you can't really go above these things. You already feel overwhelmed, or maybe it's like, you're needing to spend more time with God, like Jesus did, like going away from the crowds and spending more time with him. But we can get so caught up in just saying yes to people all the time, so that's like another way that can kind of manifest itself. So just, keeping that in mind when we're so afraid of the opinions of other people and just wanting people to like us, that can really keep us from being able to listen to God, because we're so worried about people, being pleased with us, instead of realizing that the plan that God has for us is going to lead us in the right direction. So like I said, I've always kind of struggled with being a people pleaser and having this fear of man. But I realized, I think this was kind of in my early 20s when I was getting closer to God. And that's when I realized that kind of had less of a pull on me. Like I still struggle with this, but it's to a lot less of a degree than it was when I was a lot younger. And I realized the reason that this became less important to me is because when I got closer to God, I was more aware of his presence in my life. And before that point, I was more aware of people and their opinions than I was of God. But then I got closer to him, and it was like, oh, well, God's with me. It's like, what is he thinking in this moment, So just like kind of maybe positioning your mindset when you're in these sorts of situations, realizing God's presence in you, and that'll make it a little easier to listen to the pull that God has in your heart rather than the people in your life. And then another area that kind of helped me with this is realizing how shifty people can be, and that's not in a bad way. It's not like not looking down on people, but just realizing that, like people don't always hear from God in the right way. Like just like we miss God, other people can miss God,
Yeah, it's like how many times do we change our mind and change our opinions on things?
Just like I was saying earlier.
Weekly.
Yeah, so, sometimes we can be so invested in like when people, have a certain box that they put us in and they're like, oh, well, they're probably right. No, listen to what God is telling you instead of being so intimidated by the opinions of other people.
So one thing I thought of that can sometimes, I think, hinder me when I'm thinking of trying to follow after God's plan for my life, or maybe I'm shifting seasons and I need to know what direction to go. Something for me is the fear of the unknown. And I think sometimes what we do with this fear is when God gives us a promise or a direction or something for our life, in order to have a sense of control, it's easy to start adding timelines on it. Like, okay, well, so we feel like God's doing this in our life, or he's leading us this way. So it'll happen like this, and it'll happen by this time, and it'll happen in this way. And then we start kind of, sometimes it's dreaming, and it's okay to dream of like, what will this look like? But I think sometimes it's easy to start putting timelines. And I mean, how many times do you hear people say like, oh, well, God told me this, and then it's going to happen by this time. And it's like, did God say that? It's like, I don't think he normally really gives a lot of timelines like we think he does. I think a lot of times our timelines and circumstances are based on our fear of the unknown. And so if I can attach a timeline to a promise or a season or a new direction, then I can put my faith in that timeline. And then I feel more of a sense of control of, okay, well, it's going to happen like this, and it's going to happen by this time. And the problem with that is if God didn't give you that timeline or those circumstances, then all the enemy has to do is wait for that timeline to come and go, and it's still not happen. And now your faith crumbles.
Yeah, and there goes your faith.
Exactly. There goes your faith, right? Watch it fly out the door. It's because your faith wasn't really in God or his promise. It was in a timeline. It's got to happen by this time, or it's got to happen in this way. And so I think something that we need to relinquish is that need to control what God is leading us into, right? Because it can be so scary. The fear of the unknown is real.
It is.
Like, it's a real thing. I'm not suggesting that you should just not be afraid of it, because that's ridiculous. It's going to be something that is scary at times. But what's important is that we don't start allowing that fear to push us to start trying to control the situation with timelines and circumstances, because then what happens is our faith can attach to those. And then if it ends up not happening that way, then it's really easy to lose faith. And faith is a substance of things hoped for. And if you start losing your hope because it didn't happen the way you thought, now your faith has nothing to cling to. And so I think it's just really important to let go of that. Kind of like what I said before, the word is a lamp to our feet and a light to our path. It's easy to try to get ahead and start thinking about what the next 10 steps are going to look like. And maybe God's only showing you this next step. And I think about everything amazing that's happened in my life, whether it's marrying Jeff, my current, job situation, the home I'm living in. Like, none of these things I could have guessed, because they were so supernaturally orchestrated that even my wildest expectations couldn't have led me down this road. But it was just feeling like God was nudging me this way, this way, this way. And I did it, and I took a step. And now I look back and go, my gosh, thank you, God, it didn't work out the way I thought, because this is so much better. And so I think kind of recognizing when we're allowing that fear to cause us to grip onto things, and just kind of relinquishing that need to control it.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like, if God, God only knows what's going to happen in the future, right? Like, we might want to go 10 steps ahead, but the problem is that we don't know what's going to be 10 steps ahead. Like, I kind of mentioned this earlier, but with my job, so much has changed in the ministry that we work for. And I couldn't have guessed what would have changed that would have caused me to be in a different place than I am now. Only God knows that. That's why it would probably freak us out if we knew a lot ahead. It's oh, well, why is all this going to happen to me?
Freak us out. And we probably try to make it happen on our own.
Exactly.
Especially if it's a good thing, it's easy to be oh, that's awesome. And so then we try to force it. And
exactly.
And we try to knock down doors. Now it's not really going to work out the way it was supposed to,
Yeah. In James 4:13, it says, "Look here, you who say, today or tomorrow we will be going to a certain town, and we will stay there a year. We will do business there and make a profit. How do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? Your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while, then it's gone. What you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to do it, we will live and do this or that." And I think that this verse can make you feel a little bit like before in the past when I read it, I was like, oh gosh, like I'm not supposed to make any plans or anything. But I think what the problem was is not that they made plans, but that God wasn't in the plan. It was just like, we're just going to do this and do that. So again, like it's not a problem of moving forward. Like God wants us to make plans about careers, and he wants us to follow those desires in our heart. But just like to your point, making sure that we're listening to God and like, praying about what God wants for us and then moving forward with that,
Okay, so another area that I thought of when it comes to things that can hinder us in moving forward or knowing what God's will for our life is comfort zones. And you actually talked about this, I think, in our episode last week about the mind and our thoughts, which you should definitely check out.
Yes. But
comfort zones are something that can really keep us stagnant in a season that we're meant to move forward from. And they can kind of cause us to almost ignore his leadings and ignore the pull that we feel to something more. There's something in the Bible called holy dissatisfaction. And I think a lot of times when God is trying to move us into a new season or in a new direction, he gives us almost like a holy dissatisfaction with where we're at to stir us up to something new. But if you're just so focused on the comfortability of your season, which I can completely relate to, I think that's something I'm actually going through right now is I just want everything to stay the same. I love my home.
Yeah,
I love
too.
my, everything. And I'm just like, why can't everything just stay exactly the same? And it's hard because most of the things that you want to stay the same are things you can't control. And so that's a big part of the problem, But also, if there's never any change, there's never any growth. And we're meant to grow and expand. And if you are honest with yourself, the dreams that you have on your life are going to require a lot of growth. They're not about staying comfortable and staying in the same space. If you were in this exact same situation 10 years from now, I don't think you would actually think that's a good thought.
That's
right?
true. Yeah.
And yet we don't want to go through a lot of the change that it requires to get to where we want to go. And so something that I think can help with this frustration that I've been trying to do is also doing things that make you uncomfortable or things that are new for you or things that cause you to grow. So obviously there's only so much you can do because God is the one leading you in this change. But sometimes when I start feeling like I know I don't really want anything to change, I try to always challenge myself. So I make sure I'm always doing like a workout that challenges me, or maybe I should try a few new recipes this week and see how they turn out, or try a DIY craft and see how that works, or try something in the home that maybe is not really something that I'm used to doing. And there's lots of little small things that you can do that will kind of pull you out of your comfort zone. I've listened to a lot of leadership and like business podcasts, and a lot of really successful people will say they constantly do things to push them outside of their comfort zone, even if it has nothing to do with like their business, right? They'll just take fencing classes, or they'll take, they'll learn a new language. I'm trying to learn a language right now, and I'm kind of really pushing myself to learn it more.
Which
and more.
language?
Français.
Oh. Oui, oui.
Oui, oui. But, it's just doing little things like that you love. It can all be things that you love, right? Like it doesn't have to be things that make you miserable, but it's things that maybe you don't feel like you're amazing at right out the bat. Yeah. And it just kind of pushes you to have to try things and step out of your comfort zone, so that when God does call you into new seasons and he asks you to step outside of that comfort zone, it's still a risk and it still takes faith, but it's not like you've lived this really like sheltered life, numb to anything different. It's like you're kind of like, okay, yeah, that scares me, but I know that I'm ready for this challenge and I want to face it. And it kind of helps our attitudes with that.
Yeah. And honestly, like our imaginations are so limited that we might think that it's not good, or we might think that, oh, if this were just to stay this way, this is the best. But then we realize what God brings is so much better. And I was kind of thinking about the run, the first time I did the Disney run.
Oh, the half marathon? Yeah.
Like my imagination of what would happen was honestly kind of negative, and it turned out being one of the best things, like the most fun things I've
now
ever done.
She's done them again
Now
without me, and
yeah, like I'm never gonna do a full, but yeah, like the half marathon.
We'll see.
It was so much fun, and it's because
Yeah.
I didn't have the full picture of what it could look like,
Yeah.
So just realizing that God's plan is bigger than what our limited thoughts can imagine for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Just because it's uncomfortable doesn't mean you won't like it.
Exactly. Yeah. Questions?
Okay, question time. So Felicia, tell me, when it comes to following God's plan for our life, how do I know if a desire is for now or for later? And what I mean by that is I think sometimes God gives us visions and like dreams for our future and things that we want to do. And it's hard to know, is this something I need to meditate on and it's going to be birthed later? Or is this something that I need to start putting my hand to now and start working on it? Like, how do you not get so double-minded and know if something is for right now or if something is for dreaming and for meditating on?
Well, I feel like with that, a lot of times in life, if there's a desire we have on our heart and we try to move forward with it, but it just feels like stuff is difficult, like it just feels like the timing's not right, and other people in our life that would be part of that plan, like they aren't ready, that might be a sign that it's just not time yet. Because I feel like there's been stuff in my life where I wanted to move forward and it felt like just difficult. There was, it wasn't an easy thing. And then when that time came, like God just made it happen. And it wasn't like, I'm just sitting back not doing anything. Like, faith without works is dead. So it's like, it's important to make sure you're putting your hand to that. But I think when it is God's time, it'll just happen a little bit more with grace, I guess.
Yeah. That's good.
Should we be afraid that we've gotten too far off track from God's plan? And if not, why not?
No. I feel like that question answered itself, but yeah, no, you should not be afraid that you've gone too far off track. I think it is really important that we take every moment seriously, because we only have a limited amount of time on this earth, and that's just the truth. And so you don't want to waste it. You don't want to spend all this time, chasing after things that aren't going to fulfill you. However, if you're in a place where you feel like you have wasted all this time, God redeems the time. Right? It says that in his word. And so we don't have to be afraid of missing out. The enemy wants you to feel like it's too late for you. You're too old. You're too far gone. You've messed up too many times. God can't trust you. Like, he'll try to convince you that you should just give up completely, because he doesn't want you using the time you have left on this earth to impact the kingdom for God. It's all mind games. And so we absolutely should never be afraid that we've wasted too much time, but it should be kind of an alert feeling of like, okay, you know what? How am I going to spend the rest of my time on this earth? And actually making it a life and a story worth telling so that it can actually impact people on this earth.
That's so good. Yeah. I had heard something from Dr. Caroline Leaf, who I talked about in the last episode, but she mentioned that, like, if you mess up or if your day is going really bad, instead of thinking about, like, this day's ruined, like maybe you had a really bad first hour of your day, breaking your day up into, like, 4 sections where it's like, okay, the morning didn't go great, but, like, I have a chance to start over in the afternoon. And it's kind of like that. Like, if you feel like you've gotten off track so far, like you've said, not being like, well, now it's just wasted. Even if you're, gotten older or anything, like, there's always that chance to start in a new place, and that's never a waste of time.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode. I hope that you got some good spring cleaning tips for following God's will for your life. And be careful with the spray bottle. And I hope that you will subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon so that you can be notified when we come out with our future episodes.
And if you didn't know, we're also on Instagram and Facebook, so make sure to check us out on there. And until next week, remember
To have courage
and be kind.